The highway stretched out like a ribbon of black silk under the night sky, illuminated only by sporadic streetlights and the faint shimmer of stars. The sleek black SUV purred along the asphalt, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Inside, Denzel Washington gripped the steering wheel with one hand, his other resting casually on the armrest. The serene drive was a much-needed reprieve from his demanding schedule, a rare moment to be alone with his thoughts. Suddenly, the tranquility shattered. Red and blue lights exploded in the rearview mirror, their pulsating brilliance cutting through the shadows. A shrill siren pierced the silence, demanding attention. Denzel's brow furrowed as he glanced at the mirror. "Why am I being pulled over?" he muttered to himself, easing the SUV to the side of the road. The car rolled to a halt on the shoulder, its engine humming softly. Denzel's heart raced, but his face remained calm. Years of experience had taught him to maintain composure in moments of unpredictability. He reached for his wallet and pulled out his driver's license, placing it on the dashboard. In the side mirror, he watched the officer approach. The young man moved with a deliberate, almost mechanical precision, his hand resting on the holster of his flashlight. His uniform was immaculate, the badge gleaming under the artificial light. As he reached the window, the beam of his flashlight pierced through the glass, illuminating Denzel's face. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone clipped and devoid of warmth. He barely glanced at Denzel, his eyes darting to the documents instead. Denzel complied without hesitation, his movements slow and deliberate. "Of course, officer. Here you go." The officer scrutinized the papers, his expression unreadable. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his voice tinged with an accusatory edge. Denzel shook his head. "I'm not sure, officer. Was I speeding? Your vehicle was swerving slightly back there. Been drinking tonight?" The question hung in the air, heavy with insinuation. Denzel's gaze didn't waver. "No, sir. I don't drink." Perhaps it was the uneven road surface? The officer's lips tightened. He leaned closer, his flashlight now aimed at the interior of the car. "Mind if I ask where you're headed at this hour?" Denzel's grip on the wheel tightened momentarily before he released it, letting out a slow breath. "Just heading home. Long day at work." The officer's eyes flickered with a hint of hesitation, but his demeanor remained rigid. "Step out of the vehicle, please." The request, though polite in wording, carried an undertone of command. Denzel's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his movements deliberate and unthreatening as he opened the door and stepped onto the gravel shoulder. The cool night air bit at his skin, a stark contrast to the warmth inside the car. "Spread your arms and turn around," the officer instructed, his hand hovering near his holster. Denzel complied, his calm demeanor unshaken despite the growing tension. "What's this about, officer?" he asked, his voice steady. The young man didn't answer immediately. He patted Denzel down, his movements brisk and impersonal. Finally he stepped back, his face unreadable. "Just routine, sir. Safety first." Denzel nodded, though his eyes held a quiet intensity. "Safety, of course. But may I ask why the flashlight and the tone? It seems a bit accusatory." The officer's jaw tightened, his earlier confidence faltering slightly. He avoided Denzel's gaze, focusing instead on his notepad. "Just doing my job, sir." As the night deepened, the tension between the two men seemed to thicken. Denzel's calmness contrasted sharply with the officer's barely concealed nervousness. Each passing moment raised unspoken questions. Why was the officer so on edge? And what would it take to defuse the situation? The night seemed to hold its breath as Denzel stood on the side of the road, illuminated by the pulsing red and blue lights of the police cruiser. The officer, still young and rigid with authority, kept his hand near his holster, his posture tense. Denzel's calm demeanor was unyielding, but within him, a storm of emotions began to stir. "Do you know who I am?" Denzel finally asked, his voice even and composed, though it carried an unmistakable weight. He wasn't seeking to flaunt his identity but rather to shift the perspective, to humanize himself in the eyes of the officer. The officer's face hardened, and his jaw tightened as though the words had struck a nerve. "Does it matter?" he replied curtly, his tone almost defiant. Denzel held the officer's gaze for a long moment. His silver-gray eyes, seasoned by years of navigating the complexities of life, searched the younger man's face. He saw not malice but something more telling. Insecurity, perhaps even fear. It was a look he recognized, one he had worn himself in the early years of his career. "It shouldn't matter," Denzel said quietly, breaking the silence. "But sometimes it does. Not because of fame or status but because we all carry our own stories. Stories that deserve to be understood." The officer's brows knitted together. He shifted uncomfortably, his confidence visibly wavering. "I don't need a lecture," he snapped, though the edge in his voice had dulled. Denzel raised his hands slightly in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to lecture you, son. Just trying to have a conversation. That's all." But the officer's defenses were still up. "You think you can talk your way out of this? You think I'm just going to let you off because of who you are?" Denzel's expression didn't change. "I never said that. I just want to understand why we're here on this road in this moment. What led us both to this interaction?" The question seemed to catch the officer off guard. He hesitated, his eyes darting away as though searching for an anchor in the swirling uncertainty of the exchange. The conversation took on a sharper edge as the officer, perhaps out of habit or training, began listing the supposed infractions. "Your vehicle was swerving back there. Could have been reckless driving or—" He trailed off, his voice losing conviction. The unspoken implication lingered in the air like an unwelcome guest. Denzel's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone measured. "Swerving? On an empty road at this hour? I'm not sure I follow." "It's protocol," the officer said almost defensively. "We're trained to watch for signs of impaired driving." "And what signs did you see?" Denzel pressed gently, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he shifted on his feet, his discomfort growing more apparent. "You're questioning my judgment?" he asked, his tone hardening again. "I'm questioning the assumptions that led to your judgment," Denzel replied. "Because assumptions, officer, can be dangerous. They've cost people their lives." The words hung heavily between them, a reminder of the larger societal context that neither man could ignore. The officer's expression flickered with something, guilt, perhaps, or realization, before he quickly masked it. For a moment, Denzel's thoughts drifted back to his own youth. He remembered the times he had been underestimated, judged unfairly, or dismissed outright. He thought of the people who had shaped him, mentors who had taught him to rise above anger, to approach conflict with understanding rather than aggression. Taking a steadying breath, he decided to share a piece of his story. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," he began, his voice softening. "I was hungry to prove myself, always ready to fight for respect, to stand my ground. But I learned the hard way that strength doesn't come from dominating others. It comes from understanding them." The officer's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying that sometimes the greatest battles aren't the ones we fight with others," Denzel said. "They're the ones we fight within ourselves. Against our own biases, our own fears." The officer's posture stiffened as though preparing to counter, but something in Denzel's words seemed to resonate. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, his gaze dropping for a moment before meeting Denzel's again. "You're saying I'm biased?" he asked, though his tone was less confrontational now. Denzel's lips curved into a faint, almost sad smile. "We all are, in some way. It's human. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Do we let it control us, or do we work to rise above it?" For the first time that night, the officer seemed to truly see Denzel, not as a potential threat or a defiant driver, but as a man with wisdom and depth. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and his hand moved away from his holster. "You talk like a preacher," he said, the faintest hint of a smile breaking through his stern demeanor. Denzel chuckled softly. "Not quite. Just someone who's been through enough to know that understanding is more powerful than judgment." The officer's gaze lingered on Denzel for a moment before realization dawned. His eyes widened slightly and his posture shifted again, this time not out of tension but out of recognition. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're Denzel Washington." Denzel's expression didn't change. "Does that matter?" he asked, echoing the officer's earlier words. The young man's face flushed with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it, closing it again. Instead, he nodded, his earlier hostility melting away into something closer to respect. "I didn't mean to," the officer began, but his voice faltered. "I mean, I shouldn't have." Denzel held up a hand, stopping him gently. "It's all right. What matters is where we go from here." The officer swallowed hard, his throat working against the weight of his unspoken apology. "I'm sorry," he finally managed. "I didn't mean to come across the way I did." Denzel nodded, his expression kind but firm. "Apology accepted. But remember, officer, every interaction is an opportunity to learn, to grow. Don't waste it." As the night wore on, the two men stood there on the side of the road, their earlier tension replaced by a tentative understanding. Their conversation continued, touching on topics of bias, judgment, and the importance of empathy. By the time they parted ways, both had been changed by the encounter, each carrying with them a lesson that would linger far beyond that quiet highway. As Denzel climbed back into his SUV and drove away, the officer watched him go, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. When he looked down, he realized that Denzel had slipped something into his hand during their handshake. It was a signed movie ticket with a simple note written on the back. "Every moment is a chance to change the story. Make yours a good one." The officer stared at the ticket, a mixture of awe and humility washing over him. "I'll never forget this," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the hum of the departing SUV. The night air was still cool as the officer stood frozen, the movie ticket in his hand, the words scrawled on its back echoing in his mind. "Every moment is a chance to change the story. Make yours a good one." His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the edges of the card, the significance of the encounter beginning to take root in his thoughts. The red and blue lights of his cruiser still pulsed, their rhythm oddly soothing now, as though urging him to reflect. He leaned against his patrol car, staring down the stretch of the empty highway where the black SUV had disappeared moments ago. His earlier confidence, the almost rehearsed bravado, had crumbled. In its place was a deep sense of humility and a growing awareness of how close he had come to letting bias dictate his actions. The officer's name was Nathan Carter, and though he was young in his career, he had always believed he was fair, impartial, and committed to justice. Tonight, however, he saw himself in a different light. Nathan took a deep breath and sank into the driver's seat of his cruiser, switching off the flashing lights. The sudden darkness enveloped him, but it was not the kind of darkness that brought fear. Instead, it was introspective, almost comforting. He replayed the conversation in his mind, Denzel Washington's calm demeanor, his words of wisdom, and the quiet authority that had shifted the entire dynamic of their interaction. Nathan's training had emphasized control, authority, and following protocol, but Denzel's approach had been entirely different. He had used empathy, understanding, and patience to navigate the situation. And in doing so, he had revealed a truth Nathan could not ignore: the power of humanity in every interaction. Nathan's thoughts drifted back to his first day at the police academy. His instructor, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Harlan, had drilled into them the importance of vigilance. Trust no one. Always be prepared for the worst. Nathan had absorbed those lessons with the fervor of someone eager to prove himself. But as he sat there now, staring at the ticket in his hand, He realized that those lessons, while important, had also left him guarded, defensive, and quick to judge. What struck him most about Denzel was the way he had turned the situation into an opportunity for connection rather than confrontation. Even when Nathan had been sharp and accusatory, Denzel had remained calm, choosing dialogue over defiance. And then there was the story Denzel had shared, the one about his own struggles as a young man. Nathan hadn't expected to hear such vulnerability from someone like him. It had been disarming, almost humbling, to see a man of Denzel's stature admit to moments of doubt and failure. Nathan closed his eyes and let out a slow breath, his grip on the steering wheel tightening briefly before he released it. He knew he needed to process what had happened, to examine his own role in the interaction. Why had he been so quick to assume the worst? Was it the expensive car? The late hour? Or something deeper, something he wasn't yet ready to admit? The questions swirled in his mind, each one demanding an answer. The highway remained silent, the stars above twinkling in their timeless rhythm. Nathan felt small under their vast expanse, a reminder of his place in a world much larger than himself. He thought about his father, a man who had spent decades as a factory worker, instilling in Nathan the values of hard work and integrity. His father had always told him, treat people the way you want to be treated. It was a simple lesson, one Nathan had carried with him into adulthood. But tonight he realized he had fallen short of that ideal. As Nathan sat there, the events of the night began to crystallize into a lesson he knew he needed to carry forward. He reached for his notepad and pen, flipping to a blank page. In neat, deliberate handwriting he wrote the words, "Assumptions blind us. Empathy opens our eyes." The act of writing it down felt cathartic, a small step toward accountability. He underlined the words twice and then set the notepad aside, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear. The night was ending, but its lessons would linger. Hours later, Nathan found himself back at the precinct. The bustling energy of the morning shift a stark contrast to the quiet introspection of the night before. He clocked out and headed to the locker room, the weight of the encounter with Denzel still heavy on his mind. As he changed out of his uniform, he overheard two fellow officers discussing a recent traffic stop, their tone casual and dismissive. Nathan felt a pang of discomfort. He wanted to say something, to share what he had learned, but he hesitated. Would they understand? Would they listen? Later that day, Nathan decided to visit his old mentor, Sergeant Harlan, who had retired a few years ago. The man lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a sprawling garden that he tended to with meticulous care. Harlan greeted Nathan with a warm smile, his weathered face lighting up with recognition. "Carter, what brings you out here?" Harlan asked, clapping a hand on Nathan's shoulder. "I needed to talk," Nathan admitted, following Harlan to the porch where they settled into a pair of rocking chairs. Nathan recounted the events of the previous night, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. He spoke of his initial assumptions, his defensiveness, and the way Denzel had dismantled his preconceived notions with grace and wisdom. Harlan listened intently, nodding occasionally but remaining silent until Nathan finished. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Sounds like you learned something important, Carter. Something they don't teach at the academy?" Nathan nodded. "I did. But now I'm wondering how to take that lesson and use it. How do I make sure I don't fall back into old habits?" Harlan leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You start by recognizing that change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, a commitment. And it starts with how you approach every single interaction. You've got to remind yourself that every person you meet is carrying a story you don't know. Treat them with the respect you'd want if the roles were reversed." The words resonated deeply with Nathan, and he nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir. That helps." Harlan smiled. "Good. Now don't just think about it. Live it." Nathan left Harlan's house feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to hold himself accountable, to learn from his mistakes and grow. The memory of Denzel's calm, steady voice would serve as a guide, reminding him of the power of understanding and the importance of seeing people as more than their circumstances. In the weeks that followed, Nathan began to approach his work with a new perspective. He made a conscious effort to listen more, to ask questions instead of jumping to conclusions. He sought out opportunities to connect with people, to understand their stories and struggles. And with each interaction he felt himself changing, becoming not just a better officer but a better person. One evening, as Nathan was patrolling a quiet neighborhood, he spotted a group of teenagers gathered near a basketball court. They were laughing and joking, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. For a moment, Nathan hesitated, the old instincts urging caution. But then he remembered Denzel's words. Every interaction is a chance to learn. He parked his cruiser and stepped out, walking toward the group with a friendly wave. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, holding up a basketball he had retrieved from the trunk of his car. The teenagers exchanged surprised glances but nodded, their initial wariness fading as Nathan began to shoot hoops with them. They talked about school, their favorite teams, and their dreams for the future. By the end of the evening, Nathan had earned their trust, not through authority but through authenticity. As he drove away that night, Nathan couldn't help but smile. The road to change was long, but he was on it, one step at a time. And he knew, deep down, that the lesson he had learned on that quiet highway would stay with him for the rest of his life. The words on the back of the ticket echoed in his mind, a reminder of the night that had changed everything. Every moment is a chance to change the story. Make yours a good one. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to support more powerful storytelling like this. And don't stop there, turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next video. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below to let us know how this story impacted you or what you'd like to see next. Your feedback helps us create meaningful content that connects with you. Thank you for being a part of our community. Your voice matters.